Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us on this edition of MedTalks. Today's topic is frustration and anger. This virtual broadcast is brought to you by the Sechelt Hospital Foundation and our good friends at the Sunshine Coast Credit Union. Technical services are by the Sari Media Group and, of course, all kinds of help from people behind the scenes. My name is Joanna Piros. I'm on the board of the Sechelt Hospital Foundation, and I am delighted to be your host for these discussions, which we hope will cultivate our collective resilience. As we've said all along, whatever emotions you're feeling during this troubled time, it's okay. How you act out those emotions, however, is not necessarily okay. When the Sunshine Coast RCMP reports numerous occasions of grocery store employees, healthcare workers, and other frontline staff being verbally abused, threatened, and spat upon, it seems clear that for some people, their emotions are managing them and not the other way around. So these weekly conversations are part of the way we would like to help immunize you by giving you insights into what's happening in our hearts and minds while we navigate so much uncertainty. And as always, we are very fortunate to have our amazing panel available once again, all from their very own spaces on the Sunshine Coast. They will gladly take your questions towards the end of the broadcast. Please use the chat feature to type your questions for the panel. We'll collect those up and we will try to get to them by about 2:40. And again, just a reminder, you have to be logged into a Google account to be able to enter the chat. So let me introduce our fantastic panel. Dr. Raul Gupta works as an integrative medical physician, professional coach, and mindfulness instructor. Dr. Lisa Kitt is a registered psychologist who specializes in traumatic stress and related mental health injuries. And Dr. Marius Velgemoot is a consultant psychiatrist with Vancouver Coastal Health. He is the psychiatry lead for the Sunshine Coast and also lectures at the University of British Columbia. So Marius, can we go to you first, please, to talk us through big picture, where does anger come from?
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be with you again. It's always exciting to connect on this platform. And as I said last time, Sunshine Coast, we survived another week. So well done. One of the good things is I can frown today with confidence. My frown line is a manifestation of anger and frustration. As we go through life and we have different experiences, we have facial expressions. As much as we have facial expressions and emotions, we have behaviors. And when we talk about this topic of anger and frustration, it sort of ties into the topic of aggressive behavior. So without specifying exactly which one we're reflecting on, we'll be talking about this collectively. Now, being a psychiatrist, I absolutely love the brain. I love human behavior. I'm fascinated by anatomy. And when I talk to you, I look beyond what I see and I think to myself, which circuits are running in your brain at the moment? Which ones are hyperactive? Which ones are slow to fire and so forth? So when it comes to the aggressive behavior and the anger and the frustration, it's such a multifactorial thing. There's the biological influence. We have the psychological influence. We have the social, cultural influence. All these things contribute to what we experience in terms of behavior. And why this is such a relevant discussion for today and for this time we find ourselves in is because we're all stressed. And we're all facing different challenges, and life is presenting different challenges to us. Challenges we're not that much used to. We don't have a guideline to read on how to behave during this time. And then we see these reports of people behaving in strange ways we don't get to understand, ways that are sometimes outside of someone's personality, and you might even find yourself behaving in a way that you think, where did this just come from? So during this time of distress, our resources, our internal resources, our coping mechanisms, it's different than what we're used to. What we have to fall back on is different. Our levels of frustration is different because we are fearful and we want to preserve life and health. We get frustrated with people around us when they don't seem to apply the same strategies and value things in the same way as we do. And like most biological organisms in this world, we will react. And we want to defend our lives, pretty much. So this is sort of a platform, just the beginning of our discussion as to why we become aggressive. So somewhere between the limbic system, the frontal lobe, and the different basal ganglia, things go wrong, things misfire, or maybe fires accurately, but our frontal lobes don't quite want to inhibit what we're experiencing. Remember, hey, let me use this as an analogy. I've got a almost, 2 years and 10-month-old boy at home. Wonderful, I love him to bits. But when that boy gets upset, he doesn't make any secret of it. He just rages. He just lets it all out. And the reason why, he doesn't quite have a frontal lobe yet. Our frontal lobes develop as we grow older. That inhibits that impulsivity of our sort of instinctual side. And during times of fear and distress, when our defenses are affected, our frontal lobes don't always fire that nicely. And we find ourselves responsive to various emotions and impulses. So I'll leave it at that for now, and we'll start elaborating on that. So I think the first thing I would like to ask my panel members here, just in terms of behavior and different emotions, what is it that we're facing at the moment? What's most prominent? And I know we all see different things, but let's delve into that.
Mm-hmm. I go first, Ron? You want me to go first?
Why don't you go ahead, Lisa?
I think for me, I'm seeing a range of emotions, but related to our topic, I am seeing a lot of irritability in people, people coming to session and just saying things like, I'm so irritable and pissed off right now with my spouse, my children, the teacher at the school, the person traveling to the Sunshine Coast from Vancouver. I just can barely contain. I have such short fuse right now, and I'm really irritable. I'm seeing that a lot. So related to that anger. And I love your piece around the frontal lobe. I think of the frontal lobe as the emergency brake, right? It's our capacity to stop bad behavior. And when we're really stressed, when we're really anxious, the frontal lobe goes offline and then we behave badly, whatever that badly means. So I'm seeing more of that. People's frontal lobes not fully in their best state, and therefore they're reacting in a more irritable way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I concur with what you're describing, Lisa, and I appreciated, Marius, how you described even just the function of anger. So I just maybe want to reiterate that idea that anger is a healthy, necessary, and natural, even intelligent function within us. It's really surfacing because something important to us is either being threatened or some need of ours is not being met. And so from that perspective, it's actually a healthy emotion we want to, in a sense, honor and acknowledge. The challenge is, as my colleagues have been describing, is that when stress levels are high, if we've had a background of some traumatic experiences as well, we can get hijacked by the anger itself. And so I'm seeing it a lot even just within the healthcare world. I'm seeing some of my colleagues having to deal with patients who are frustrated and angry, maybe because for non-COVID issues, they're having surgeries postponed or canceled. Some of their tests are being canceled. Maybe feeling some frustration at not getting some of their medications for more than 1 month at a time. I've heard from others, like home care workers, who are frustrated that some of the elderly people that they're trying to serve, even though they're in full protective equipment, will not actually allow them to come in to serve them because they're actually seeing them as a threat. So there's a lot of healthcare frustrations. And then, of course, another big one actually is just physicians and nurses themselves feeling frustrated around maybe not being able to provide the kind of care we would usually like to in an efficient manner. And then sometimes even having to deal with people who don't seem to really understand the restrictions that are on the system itself, and maybe complaining in ways without really realizing how hard people are working to try to keep things safe. So those are some of the other examples that are coming to my mind.
Mm-hmm.
So Lisa, I like your comment on irritability being very prominent, and Raul, the reflection on the normality and actually it being an intelligent behavior, frustration and anger sometimes. It's not always bad. We're very much into what it presents as. Now, one of the fundamental or basic themes in understanding the human mind is the concept of projection. So when you are limited in your own resources, you're feeling stressed and affected by all the things happening around us. Some things in your environment that would normally not irritate you, as just like everyday stuff, suddenly you find yourself highly frustrated and irritable by these things. Where it's normally nice if your little pooch licks between your two toes, now you might say, "No, stop! Don't do that. You're frustrating me." Maybe your kid is jumping on you, and that's normally a good time to wrestle. Suddenly you find yourself, "Oh man, I don't want to be doing this," or various other examples. So projection will be all around. So when you find yourself irritable and angry, remember, objectively speaking, it probably isn't really an objectively validated, but it's my inner sense of irritability, uncertainty, fear, and the slightest thing around me just gets me going.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that everywhere. I see that we're on the receiving end of that, and we're on the giving end of that. So being aware of that emotion.
Sorry, Mars. I like what you just said. One of the themes that I'm seeing a lot in people is that all of whatever comes to the surface. So if you think about your, self at worst, just a bad day, those days you wake up and you're just not at your best. Right now, the last 7 weeks in this pandemic, I'm seeing an amplification. It's almost like a pressure cooker of everybody's emotional state. And so wherever people go on their sort of self at worst days, that's just closer to the surface right now. Because I think your point around, we don't get those ways to keep ourselves as well as possible. All those kinds of activities that we're missing right now aren't there to help balance us. And so that amplification of our nervous systems is there. And so irritability, certainly for me, I can attest to this, is coming to the fore much quicker. My threshold is, that wick of patience is much smaller right now than it was before. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as you're saying that, Lisa, and you talked about teachers and parents.
Yeah.
A lot of people right now are having very little time to themselves.
That's right.
A lot of people are having to manage their children, their jobs, their parents, their loved ones, and not actually having the time to take care of themselves. And so I'm actually, both within myself and some of my closest friends, some of our frustration comes from a lack of downtime and forgetting that this pandemic is influencing us. So we have higher expectations of ourselves, and we're setting ourselves up for the same kind of pace and feeling frustration and anger at ourselves. And Marius, that comes back to what you're saying, is then we can project that on other people. And sometimes what I found is if I can actually slow down a little bit and notice what I'm most frustrated and most irritable about is I'm not getting my own basic needs met. I'm maybe hungry, or I'm tired, or I need exercise. And, I really hope we're going to explore that with the mindfulness practice. How can we get more curious about some of these different states of mind that typically we tend to project outwards?
I like
and
that.
Part of the anger, frustration discussion is also that awareness when you are on the receiving end of someone's anger and frustration, and it's not justified. Are you going to be returning that anger with more aggressive behavior, or are you going to stretch yourself a little bit, just a little bit, in realizing that probably this person is going through a heck of a lot? Well, I know they are. And although none of this is justified, maybe I can just, find a little bit of space in myself in the grocery store when someone looks at me in a frustrated way, or they suddenly jump out of the way just because I'm coming around the corner still 5 meters away. It's nothing personal, right? Mm-hmm. When you are on the receiving end of someone's projections, you need to realize it's nothing personal. Mm-hmm. And we need to just stop a little bit and breathe and not be too reactive. These things will slow down again. But at this moment in time, people are very reactive, and we don't have to engage in that way.
Mm-hmm. I'm as you're both talking, I'm thinking about teasing apart some of these emotional states a little bit. I think as I listen, I'm hearing that some of the behavior that's coming out as anger isn't really anger, right? It's something else. So anger can be both a primary emotion, and it can be a defense or a secondary emotion. And if we dig a little deeper, there's another emotion that's often harder for us to feel. Maybe it's shamed by society or in our family or for whatever reason. It's the primary emotion, but we're not allowed to let it out. I think of a lot of people I work with that anger is the go-to. They have mad, bad, and sad, and mad is the primary. And so, in a state of stress, we move into fight or flight. Well, some people's go-to is fight, right? And yet the primary emotion under that is often something else. And I think right now, as I listen to my clients and my friends and in my life, it's often fear, right? Fear of a pandemic, fear of the future, fear of a whole bunch of things. And clinically, when I have working with people, I handle those things very differently, right? As Mari says, you were talking, I was like, oh, let's be curious about people. Let's be curious about people in the grocery store and be curious about the function of their behavior. Is this person truly mad? Right? And mad, it's a core emotion about injustice usually. Or are they scared? Right? And my reaction to that is going to be really different if I can just get curious about what's going on for them and then meet that with some compassion, some understanding, which takes slowing down and all the things you guys mentioned. My response will be different. And so I want us to just make sure that we're talking about anger, but often anger isn't just anger, right? It's fear or sadness or, yeah.
So I love that you brought up that word curiosity, because I think that's such a key part of this. I remember reading from one of my colleagues a study that was describing that curiosity really is the antidote to judgments. And
absolutely.
The challenge is that we can only stay in a curious state of mind for about 2 to 3 seconds. That we can't help it. We're continually making judgments about our situations, and that can often be in the form of criticisms or blame. And one of the big challenges with anger as a core emotion, in my experience, and one of the things I'm seeing happen right now, is when we are angry, we tend to orient to what's the same as us. We tend to orient to what's more certain, and it's more likely we're going to therefore see more discrimination, more racism, more othering, exactly. And that can unfortunately lead to even further disparity and further injustice.
Yeah.
And so I really love what you're saying about, can we get curious about some of those deeper emotions, whether it's fear, a lot of that I'm seeing, but I'm also seeing a lot of hurt, people actually grieving the loss of a life that they had before, or even people that they care deeply about that are suffering, or even hurt around some of their own decisions and how they've potentially let themselves down. And then it's really hard to be with that, so we can project that sense outwards, and it's certainly to not only our own cost, but to others as well.
Well said.
So understanding that deeper emotion, or although anger and frustration and aggression is very much a primary emotion, sometimes it is just a product of other emotions, as we're discussing now. So understanding those primary emotions, understanding what is it that led up to this point? How did this collective experience come to this point of me behaving in this way? And then my mind goes to the whole social psychological model of anger and aggression. As youngsters, we don't always learn to deal with emotions or understand emotions. I mean, different cultures, different settings, worldviews, philosophies, all these things come together to collectively give us an experience and form the way we view the world. But oftentimes we model things that we've seen before. So I am now frustrated and anxious, and my father used to then get aggressive as an example. And this is what I saw as a kid. So now I'm just highly likely to become aggressive. I'm not even going to challenge anything that I'm feeling. I'm just going to slot right into what I've seen as a child and in my formative years, and I'm going to just continue along those lines. Therefore, we have to look at ourselves a little bit here, to understand a lot. Let's change that to a lot. We have to look at ourselves a lot here. What is it that I saw in my past? What is it that's really me? What is it that I'm actually feeling? Don't just be a product of your environment and your past and your life. Be authentic in the moment. Look at what the heck is happening.
Well, and these are skills, right? I think what we're talking about are core, I think they're essential core human skills. And unfortunately, most of us haven't learned or been modeled in our lives. If I had a magic wand, I would I would make everybody's emotional intelligence a priority, period, full stop, educationally, developmentally, from the get-go. And yet here we are, with people not having those skills and trying to teach them almost retroactively. That's what I do in my work, is I really try to bring people's emotional intelligence and sense of themselves up to speed. And I want people to think of those as skills. You can learn them. Some of them are hard.
Yeah.
This isn't really easy work, but it's possible.
It can be learned. These things can develop. Our brains have the beautiful capacity of neuroplasticity. Let's use it. It was given to us freely.
Yeah.
Well,
and we all have emotion, right? We all have these emotions. It's not that we don't have them. We have them. We need to learn to use them properly.
And as you're describing that learning process, what was coming into my mind was just thinking about trauma and actually just the fact that it's a survival mechanism within us. So, if we think about just that whole kind of spectrum of this emotion of frustration, my sense is it starts more with irritability. And then if it builds, it gets into frustration, and then it becomes anger. And then it gets all the way to rage. Yeah. And the next step after rage is we tend to feel helpless. And so these kind of more core and more challenging emotions are coming up because we actually are getting more desperate. Mm-hmm. And so the ability to which we can actually learn to notice those earlier signs of irritability, of minor frustrations, before they've gotten to the stage of rage, and then it's really hard to stop that ball from continuing to roll. That's a great skill, as you're describing, Lisa and Marius, that we can start to become aware of those signs, and it's going to be much easier for us to intervene when things haven't had a ton of momentum behind them.
Raul, that is so important. That's one of the most important things, and one of the biggest gifts you can give yourself is to learn that part about your triggering process as it unfolds. I know exactly when I'm being triggered. I know what happens in my mind. I know what it feels like. I know where my thoughts go. And Raul just mentioned now that if you catch this early enough, you need much less effort to resolve it. But when this is snowballed and it's compounded and you're at that point of absolute rage, it's harder and harder and harder to inhibit that. So learn what does your brain look like? How does this process play out for you? And intervene early on, because the emotion is real. The emotion is not bad. Anger and frustration is alive and well in all of us, and it's an emotion that serves a good purpose. But how we give outing to how we manifest that behavior is really the question.
I really like that. There's a big skill set around some of this stuff. But one of the really simple things is just recognizing, like having that awareness that you're feeling something and then trying to know what it is. I often use the term name it to tame it, right? So if we don't want to escalate our behavior and get above, I often do Marius, you make fun of me with all my hand gestures, but this continuum of, above 6 or 7 out of 10, very hard to change behavior. So if you can go, oh, I'm really pissed off right now. I'm really angry. Is it anger? Is it fear? What's going on for me? Just be super curious about that. And then try to name, because if we name the emotion and we get it right, it actually processes appropriately quite quickly. If we get it wrong, if it's anger and really it's fear is the core emotion, it doesn't really process well, and then it usually keeps going. So I like this, trying to teach people to understand their emotional state and actually name it, which brings the frontal lobe online, which can help then put the emergency brake on.
And Raul, you mentioned yesterday about feeling the emotion in the moment is just as essential.
Absolutely. And along with that, I think if we can do that with trusted colleagues or people that we love, we're social beings. So I think one of the things that we can do if we're actually facing somebody who's feeling angry, actually match that energy a little bit with them. If we can get a sense of what they're angry about and actually support them and saying, you know what, that's worth being concerned about. I found actually meeting that person with their anger, rather than telling them not to feel angry, rather than saying, oh, you shouldn't be feeling that way, actually helping them get a sense of whatever is going on with them and normalizing it is actually a great way to help that person feel less threatened. And then we can start to get curious about what are the different layers underneath that together.
Yeah, I'll often say, let me be with you in your anger. Let's do this together. I'm really curious about that anger, and I'd be really pissed off if that happened to me too. That's just not right. So let's be with this together and try to process that emotion out of your nervous system.
And all emotions can be channeled and expressed in a constructive way.
Yeah.
There is no right emotion. There is no wrong emotion. We are
Nice.
built with the full spectrum of emotion. It's about how to use that constructively and how to communicate in an uplifting way and not break people down around us. Because we're prone to do that during times of anxiety and times of fear. So it's about feeling the emotions, taking a bit of time, thinking about it, breathing, allowing you to gather yourself together some of your own thoughts, and then try and respond in a constructive way. Well, it sounds so easy when I say it like this. Boy,
It's so hard. Yeah.
it's wonderful. Let's go out and make the world a better place. Listen, if you can improve 10% in how you express your fearful emotions, that is wonderful improvement.
So what do you guys say? Should we do exactly that and practice a little bit right now? Does that feel like a good time?
Yes, it does.
I think you must first say something that will really get me upset so that I can be highly frustrated before we go.
Ooh.
Okay. Yes. Well, maybe I'll leave that to she knows how to.
Not on live television. No.
Okay. Well, I'm thinking of doing a mindfulness practice that hopefully ties in a lot of the things that we've been exploring together today. And I'm thinking of a particular acronym you may have heard of, RAIN, RAIN. I'll just walk us through that acronym because I think it can be really helpful with this particular emotion. So the R stands for recognize, as we've been talking about, this ability to kind of name or notice that we're getting some sort of arousal within us, whether it's irritability, anger, all the way to rage, and be able to recognize that something's happening. That's the R. The A then is to allow it, is to acknowledge that it's happening and create some space for us to have the emotion, rather than usually what we'll do is either suppress it, deny it, or just kind of somehow project it out there. And then the I is exactly what we've been discussing, is to get curious and investigate. So I is to investigate with some curiosity about, okay, what are some of the other underlying emotions? What's going on in my body? What are the unmet needs that I'm actually experiencing that are leading to some of this emotion? And then the N is much like we've been describing again around compassion, but it's about nurturing or nourishing the unmet need. And so what I'm hoping we can do right now is to basically do a little RAIN exercise together. And as we've been doing for the last few weeks, it's always nice to take a few moments to relax our systems a little bit. That's a great way to tell our body right now there's actually nothing to worry about, nothing to do other than to simply be here. So you might maybe just take a few deeper breaths into your belly. Or if you notice you need a bit of water or tea, taking a sip. And you could let yourself maybe find your feet on the floor and feel the contact of the ground below you. So feel the support of the earth. And as you're doing that, you might even give yourself permission to settle any of your muscles right now that might have gotten into defense mode. So if there's a way just to soften your shoulders or your jaw or your fists, just giving yourself a moment to let the system relax for a moment. And then maybe, if you don't mind, just letting yourself bring to mind something that has been an irritation or a source of frustration. And maybe not choosing something that takes you right into rage, so that's hard to work with, as we've been discussing, but something that's kind of maybe lower down from that spectrum. So it could be something you're seeing in other people, behaviors, whether that's somebody you know or somebody you live with, or it could be something within yourself or that you work with. And just letting that situation come into your mind. And maybe just being curious now as you allow this to be here. So we're recognizing an event or a situation, and we're allowing it to be here for a moment so that we can explore it and investigate. So maybe just notice, what is the impact on your body as you're reflecting on this. Maybe you'll notice some areas where you start to tighten, or your heart rate changes, or your breathing changes. You might even notice if your body starts to stiffen or get ready to act in some way. You might even notice if your thought patterns change. So kind of seeing if you could create a space where no matter what's coming up, you can just be curious without needing to judge your experience or analyze it or fix it, but just really creating a field of awareness. And then we're going to do exactly what we talked about earlier, where we're going to be curious about any other emotions that might be here around the situation. So maybe there's a sense of fear, or some anxiety, or being hurt, or a sense of loss. Maybe a sense of fatigue, overwhelm. There may be even a sense of guilt or shame that shows up. So there's really no end to the different possible emotions that could be here. And for now, we're just investigating what's true, each of us being unique, noticing what's true for you. And these emotions that we might touch upon are actually wonderful links to what we value most. So as we touch into these emotions, they in fact might help us notice what's an unmet need, what right now has been under threat. So maybe you notice, there's some fear, and what I need is a bit more safety or security. Or if there's a sense of grief, maybe what you're needing is more care, more reassurance. More connection. Or if you're noticing exhaustion, maybe there's a sense of actually needing some rest, needing some downtime. And so the end part of the RAIN exercise is just to take all that you've noticed, and in particular as you feel into whatever unmet needs are here that in some ways our irritability is pointing a finger at. How might you nourish yourself? Or how might we even nourish this need? And so for some of us, it might just be putting a hand on our heart if we notice, wow, we just need a physical touch. Or we might kind of have a sense of an embrace for ourselves. Or even something you might say that's reassuring. Or it might mean that you need to have a conversation with somebody that would actually nourish you. So each of us are going to have something entirely unique, some creative way to meet the moment. So just trusting yourself to make contact with these possibilities. seeing if whatever you come up with has a sense of compassion for yourself or others that perhaps allows us to move forward in a way that feels good. So maybe we'll end the exercise now. And I'm curious maybe if the other panelists here might just, if you're willing to share what that was like for you, that might just support some of our listeners to get a sense of what it might be like for them. And perhaps if you are listening in and you had an experience that you'd like to share with us, feel free to write in the chat box, and we'll do our best to try to share some of your experiences as well.
This is to me what is most profound about an exercise like this is the safe place where you get to examine an emotion to which at other times you may be a victim to. So when you do the mindfulness exercise, you go to the thing that just frustrates you, the thing that gets you going, the thing that sometimes leaves you acting aggressively and really just looking at it in a safe way, feeling the emotion, but training your body not to have all the physiological responses that normally come with the situation. And then to look at what the meaning behind that is. I mean, it's so self-explanatory. It's such a meaningful thing to do. And it's so essential that we engage in this way, helping ourselves understand what is happening in certain emotions.
I really like this one. I use RAIN a fair bit with clients, and I still like doing it all the time. I want to normalize. So what happened for me as I was following along was that every suggestion you offered, well, I thought, yep. Sadness, yep. Grief, yep. Fear, yep. Anxiety, yep. Anger, yep. So I want to normalize and validate that it's not just one emotion or one need. Often it's multiplicative. There are many, and it's messy. And this kind of process, though, encourages us to be in the messy and maybe get comfortable with the messy and just be in what makes us human. I think we often try to fix emotion. And for me, I think there's a real beauty and ease in just being with my emotional state and just seeing it for what it is. And from that experience, it lessens, right? I end up processing and just acknowledging what's going on for me. And there's something really nurturing about that. And that just brings me deeper into my body and feeling more calm and connected. Yeah. So thank you.
Thanks for sharing your experiences.
Yeah.
This whole
questions?
emotional discussion gets me all excited about the questions we'll be facing.
Okay, I'll bite. I have a question for you, and it comes a little bit from where we started off, or where I started off. How can you talk a little bit about this collective anger, these factions that are forming up to egg cars of people visiting the Sunshine Coast, or to take some kind of pitchforky type action? Where does that group anger come from, and how do we dissipate it? How do we deal with it?
So the core of this emotion, to me, remains fear and anxiety. But an interesting thing happens when you have a group of people around you. When you think of the way that you would normally behave, you might behave somewhat differently if it was you, the individual, standing in front of someone else. When there's this collective group of people with the same emotion, it's almost like you lose a bit of that individual responsibility and identity and what you would normally uphold, and you become part of that group expression. And that expression is still born from fear and anxiety, but it's almost like you don't have to quite take responsibility for the behavior that you show when you lose that, when you have that anonymity of a group. And I see this online often because you're sitting behind a screen and you're just speaking your mind. Yet if I met with you in person, you would be highly unlikely to say a certain thing to me. So I see this in the emotion, the collective emotion, where people just buy into whatever is happening around them without evaluating themselves, really.
Yeah, it validates their own emotional experience too. Right? It feeds their own emotional experience, that collective group think. And it is safer. As you were talking and asking the question, Joanna, and Mars, the way you answered it, what came to me, and this is not my thought, it came from a podcast. I don't remember who it was. It might have been Brene Brown. When I'm scared, I don't have to be scary. I don't have to join in the collective scary. I can just be scared. And I don't have to act that collective. I don't have to jump on the scary bandwagon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know, I just maybe to add to that, I think like fear, anger is contagious. And so there's that part of it where once we start seeing it in others, we can get kind of caught up in that sense of it as well. And, you know, we saw it even in Vancouver around the Vancouver Canucks losing Game 7. It was amazing to see what happens when people just start losing a sense of themselves. And I think another part of it is that there's an addictive quality to that sense of anger. And my sense of it is when we feel angry, we actually feel a certain sense of power that can, in a sense, make us feel less afraid and less out of control, because there's so much right now that we can't control. And so if we're angry, in some ways we feel that sense of power, but the problem is it's temporary and it's not really a deep form of power. And the only way we can keep it up is to stay angry. And that's just not going to be good for us, for other people long term. And so as you were sharing that question about what do we do with it, I was thinking back to Gandhi's words around, you know, an eye for an eye makes the whole world go blind. And I think that's just such an important part for us to remember, that, you know, when we're seeing people act in these ways, I think us acting in a similar fashion with frustration and anger towards them is not going to solve the issue. I think we have to do our best to have compassion for the behavior, but still have very strong boundaries around what we feel is right, and find ways to actually understand what's going on, what's fueling some of these behaviors, and do our best to support people to have their fears settled. That often requires actually sharing information accurately so people can understand what the risks actually are and what they aren't. And I think there's a lot of myths and misconceptions that perhaps are fueling fear in a way that doesn't serve us.
Yeah, and just the last thing to add from my side on that topic is we have to realize that we cannot take responsibility for what a group of people are doing, but we can take responsibility for what the individual is doing. So it is about being very responsible in your own emotions, your own behavior, how you express yourself, and not combating what you're seeing, Raul, as you've just said. But that sense of self-responsibility is absolutely essential.
You know, maybe just to come back to that, I love that you use the word responsibility, because I always come back to that idea of it's more the ability to respond. Mm-hmm. And that's where, you know, some of the practices we do where we slow down, we actually support ourselves to get access, Marius, as you're saying, to our prefrontal cortex. And it's going to help us be able to respond in wise and hopefully compassionate ways.
Absolutely.
Thank you for that. So can I dial in Jane McDonald now? Jane is the Executive Director of the Sechelt Hospital Foundation, and she is always the one that is curating your questions and your comments. So Jane, what do you have for us?
Sure. Thanks, everyone. We have one from obviously a young family. It says, whether we call it cabin fever or stir crazy, is it normal for tensions to run high and patients to run low in families where everyone's crawling on top of one another? Any suggestions?
I think I'll take this one.
Go for it.
Just in the sense that I'm living it. Yes. Is it normal? I mean, she's asking, he or she is answering her. Yes, it's so normal. I'm not so sure we're designed. It's a pressure cooker right now, homes, especially with kids, whether they're in school or not. We're all trying to get stuff done. There's a huge amount of pressure, not the teacher's fault, but parents somehow think there's a massive pressure around school stuff and expectations. It's just, and there's no space. I mean, I think we're lucky to live where we are. Some of us, we can get outside. I can't imagine being in an apartment in a city. But yes, this is challenging times right now. We don't get to do those things that we would normally do. Get out, get space. Kids are at school, right? All day long. And so it's just trying to be, I keep saying, kind and gentle, guys, kind and gentle on self, kind and gentle on each other. Who needs a break? Who needs a way? It's okay to just go check out. Like, what do you need right now? Check in with yourself. And it's okay that it's not all smooth and easy. It's not supposed to be right now. Just go gently, just be super kind and gentle with yourselves and everybody else. It doesn't mean your family doesn't work. It doesn't mean your marriage is failing. It doesn't mean you dislike your kids. There are going to be times where you dislike everybody in your household. Totally normal and totally okay.
Yeah, I wouldn't even be adding to what Lisa just said. I'll just reinforce very briefly to the writer of that question. You are so normal.
Yeah.
What you're experiencing is so normal. You are officially stamped, approved, normal.
And not alone.
And not alone. Not alone. It's essential that you do realize that. And so be aware of what you're feeling. Breathe, pause, take those moments, reflect, and love abundantly, because this is a challenging time.
And that's when I worry about families who don't have the resources psychologically, financially, I'm a really privileged person. I'm intelligent. I teach parenting courses, and this is damn hard. So just to normalize that for folks, but it does make me worry and want to support families who are more vulnerable right now, because this is hard.
Yeah, I love what you guys have said. So I've got very little to add other than just, again, a reinforcement of lowered expectations.
Yeah.
And play. And I know, Lisa, that's
I love that.
So I just feel like one of the big antidotes for a lot of the frustrations we're experiencing is play, and finding, like, reminding ourselves, what did we do even as kids ourselves that brought us joy? Because there's so much pressure on us right now to get stuff done, to keep ourselves safe. There's every single decision we make right now feels like it's fraught with life or death possibilities. And so I feel like we have to intentionally bring in this quality of play. And so it might be like just picking up an instrument or singing a song or watching a movie that makes your heart soften, or getting outside and running in your yard with your kids, or locking your kids outside so they can't come in. I didn't say that.
I've done it.
But really finding those places that we can find pockets of joy that can be an antidote to some of the other more challenging emotions.
In case we don't get any more. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
What I want to add there is, remember, don't wait for the emotion before you go into these, lighter scenarios, the playfulness. Do these things and the emotion will come forth from the action.
Excellent. Jane, back to you.
How to stop a frustration spiral? Any tips on how we can break the cycle or avoid what you called earlier the anger hijack?
Question.
I'm a firm believer in a very simple approach, and that is to pause, even if just for a second. And I will repeat myself again because I believe it's extremely valuable, is catch yourself, analyze yourself for a little bit. Look at how does it happen for me. Catch yourself in those early moments. Pause for a moment. Don't deny the emotion. Allow yourself to feel it. Breathe a little bit. Look for alternatives. Create some compassion before you allow yourself to spiral down that road of aggression. And you know what? Each of us will have a different thing that works for us. Find that one thing that works for you. This is the one thing that works for me.
Yeah, and what I would say works for me is because I do need some sort of cue to check in. So sometimes if I'm really busy, I'll just have my phone go off every couple of hours. And it's just a ding, but it reminds me to take a moment just to notice how I'm doing. And if I'm feeling irritable, I check, am I hungry? Have I been walked? Is there some conversation that I'm avoiding that actually I need to have with the person? Is there kind of some deeper emotion right now that's surfacing? So I love kind of, if I were to combine what Mary said already, is to like have some way to remind ourselves to pause. And if we can do that regularly, we're much more likely to pick things up early. And then having the courage to act on those early signs. I think that to me is one of the key parts is understanding that is actually going to be time well spent. And maybe the last thing I'll say is sometimes we get hijacked. So you could be as aware as you might want to be, and then something just hits us. And so part of it's just like having some compassion for ourselves around that too. If we get hijacked, we do the best we can. We may have to apologize and make some repair, but that's part of being human.
Mm-hmm.
I think the only thing I would say to add, go ahead. Go ahead, Jane.
I think you should go, Lisa. You might have had something to add there.
I love what you guys said. I think I can hear people's voices in my head, not actually, but clients and friends going, I don't have time to pause. I'm a busy working mom. I don't have time to pause. And I get that. I actually really hear that. On some days I feel like that, and yet it's so critical anyways. But sometimes I have to distract myself in the moment so I don't blow up about something, because I don't have time in the moment to actually check in and process that emotion. But I note it and come back to it because it's still in my nervous system. People often say, oh, I put that on a shelf and I'll come back to it later. There's no shelf. The shelf is our own nervous system. And it's in us. And so, one of the downsides of being pretty self-aware is that you notice everything. So I have to come back to it and either have that conversation or process the emotion or do whatever is needed. But it doesn't have to be right in the moment. I think that's my point around that. Yeah.
And it takes less time to pause than to apologize.
We do have a few minutes left, so if any of you watching do have questions, by all means type them into the chat. And Jane, I will go back to you and see if you've got another one for us.
Okay, we had one submitted. It takes a great amount of courage to do this head to heart work. Do you have any offerings or references that can help assist moving either ourselves or someone else forward? How and where to begin?
Well, I'm a big fan of Tara Brock's work. She's a meditation instructor, and she's got a lot of free talks on our website that I think help us kind of get some of those different exercises that can support us. I would perhaps just invite people to maybe trust yourself a little bit more than you might think. All of us are incredibly resilient creatures. We wouldn't get to where we are right now without a deep resilience. And that's not just in our life, but in our ancestors and through time. And so one of the things that I would invite us to do is maybe just surrender a little bit to some of your own deeper adaptive mechanisms within you. And what I've found with a lot of people that I work with is our fear of our emotions actually is way more challenging than actually stepping into the emotions themselves. Some of the science would suggest our emotions only last for about 90 seconds. Mm-hmm. And then the rest of it is just getting fueled by our thoughts and our behaviors, and it's just becoming the cycle. So we don't even have to tolerate the emotions for very long. We just need to kind of create that window. And as we start to do it a bit more regularly, it gets a lot more easy. Gets a lot easier, and there's no question doing it in the presence of other people that you trust can be very helpful.
That very aspect of repetition is extremely important, because the first time you try and rein in that wild animal in your head, it takes a lot of effort, right? But as you do it over and over and over again, and you teach yourself strategies that really work, it becomes easier to manage. And then also I want to motivate people we all have different belief systems. We all have different things we value. So whatever your belief system is, whatever you find tremendous value in, tap into that. It is a wonderful resource that is always available, always around us. The community that you belong to, it is extremely important to build resilience in that way as well, as you are ever busy training these primitive emotions from breaking loose, preventing it from breaking loose.
One of the things I hear in that question is a block between, there's all this good emotion theory and things that we have to do as human beings to be healthy. And I'm way over here and have no idea. I often say to clients, and these are often clients who weren't raised to think about their emotions. They weren't raised to talk about feelings. They weren't raised to think about themselves. They're often caregivers for other people. Some traditional masculine norms can come up around that. And so for them, there's a huge gap between where I'm wanting them, particularly related to trauma and processing emotions and where they start. So I often this is a new language, right? This is a totally new skill set, and it's like learning a different language. And so here we are. One of the things we have to do is take away the shame of that, right? So the things I'm talking about over here, emotions and self-awareness, doesn't mean weakness. It means actually courage and strength. And so, but I do a lot of psychoeducation with folks around the understanding of why this is important over here. And there is a big gap there, unfortunately, in society. I have some people resonate with Brene Brown's work around emotion and shame and the importance of connection. There's a couple websites that are really good for men and therapy and understanding why that's important. But I just want to acknowledge that gap. I think that's part of that question there. And it is a challenge. I spend a lot of time thinking about knowledge translation, how to translate mental health and emotion to the general public to get people as well as possible.
That I think it does tie in, as Lisa, you're describing that. I'm glad you used the word shame. And I think, Marius, you said compassion. And if I recall, I think that's our theme for next week. And so our hope is, even I think just with these dialogues week to week, that we can go back to some of these recordings and review some of them, because I know for myself, like, even though we covered sadness last week, I've had a few days this week where I felt sad, and I had to draw upon some of those conversations we had earlier to support that. And so I invite people maybe just to let this be a process where it can unfold over weeks. And we just titrate our experience a little bit and just do what you can today, touch into these experiences a little bit, and trust that together over the coming weeks, we can explore this field together.
Nice.
Jane, anything else there?
I think that's it for today. Thank you so much, everyone. Back to you.
All right, then. Can I ask just one question, a very practical question? Various of my kids have worked in the service, food and beverage industry. And so when I think about these young people working at the IGA or at the Super Value who are having to take this abuse, they don't really have the luxury of time to process that. Is there some language that you could suggest to these young people to set that boundary, Marius, that you were talking about earlier? That, you're angry at me. What's some language that they could put around that so that they feel like they are establishing a boundary?
I think the first thing that comes to my mind is the realization, the internal awareness that people will be sometimes acting. They will be acting in ways that are not necessarily the norm. So that internal awareness of someone is not angry at me. I wasn't the one at fault. I didn't necessarily do anything to deserve this. I mean, I'm speaking categorically. Of course, this will depend on every situation. But to me, it's not about confronting that behavior really in the moment. As you're going through a busy day with hundreds of people passing you by, it's not about confronting that emotion. It's more about protecting yourself and the awareness that this is what we're facing at the moment.
Okay, great. Raul, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question, actually. And I agree with Marius. It's not an easy one. And I feel like there's lots of layers to that. So, I would invite people to, if they can, share their boundary and do it in a compassionate way. So it might even just sound like something like, wow, I notice you're really upset. And I also notice that the words you're saying are such and such. And just want you to know the impact on me is that I feel hurt and that I'm actually working really hard to serve you. And I need you to show more respect for what we're doing here. And it might even require talking to our employers and together coming up with some systems to really keep ourselves safe. So I would actually strongly encourage people to set boundaries. And there's ways we can set boundaries, but still display that sense of compassion for others and still be quite fierce in that compassion, I think. Sorry, in that setting of a boundary. Because what I would want for those individuals is to feel safe, protected, as they're really serving all of us in getting our needs met.
Awesome. Thank you. That's wonderful. Thank you all. You're always so wonderful and so great to listen to and so calming, which is quite lovely. Also, time to say thank you to everyone that's tuned in, that's watching. Thank you to everyone that watches these in the recordings. Thank you to people that have contributed so generously to our special COVID fund. If you are in a position to give, by all means do so. If you are not in a position to give, then send us some good thoughts. Send good thoughts our way. There's a survey link at the bottom of the live feed, so please let us know what you thought, other topics that you would like to have us cover. And next week, join us again. We will, as Raul flagged for us, we'll be talking about shame and compassion. So in the meantime, stay well, stay connected. We'll see you next week. Bye for now. Good thoughts our way. There's a survey link at the bottom of the live feed, so